All right, and we are live. So we have folks joining us on Facebook and on YouTube. I am here at One More Page Books in Arlington, Virginia, but I think we have people joining us from all over the place. One super quick housekeeping note: if anyone is joining us via the Eventbrite link, you're going to see the same thing that everyone else does, but you're not going to be able to ask questions there. But there is a link to the Facebook page. So if you're on Eventbrite, you think you want to ask a question, I would click over to the Facebook stream because then you can ask something in the comments, okay? And that's how we are going to take questions. Oh, there, Connecticut is here. So that's how we are going to take questions after we get through the presentation, the discussion. We'll be looking for questions in the comments. So if you have something, go ahead and pop it in whenever your question comes up, and we will try our best to get to everything. So we're going to get started. Again, I'm Amber Taylor at One More Page Books, and we are so excited that we're able to do this Let's Talk Hamilton event a couple days before Hamilton is going to air on Disney+. We have two authors with us tonight. We have Laura Malone Elliott, who actually uses two comments. So if you have something, go ahead and pop it in whenever your question comes up, and we will try our best. I just somehow am hearing myself. That was very weird. Okay.
So you put the jinx on it by saying this was a good platform, right?
All right. So Laura
yes,
also uses the byline LM Elliott for her historical novels, like the one we're talking about tonight, Hamilton and Peggy, and also her full name for picture books. Laura was a Washington-based magazine journalist covering women's health and the arts before becoming a New York Times bestselling novelist. Her 10 novels feature both female and male protagonists, explore a variety of time periods, and have won a number of national awards as well as starred reviews. With illustrator Lynn Musinger, Laura has also published 5 picture books. She's a lifelong Virginian and a history lover. We also have Susan Holloway Scott, who's the author of more than 50 historical novels and novellas, including the one we'll be talking about tonight, I, Eliza Hamilton. Her best-selling books have received numerous awards and honors, with more than 3 million copies of her books in print. She's been published in 19 foreign countries around the world. She's also written under pseudonyms Isabella Bradford and Miranda Jarrett. And she lives with her family outside of Philadelphia, so they're both joining us from their homes. And I'm so glad that Megan Bem is able to join us tonight to serve as our moderator. She knows a lot about both of these authors and their books, and she is a theater director here in Northern Virginia, so also a nice tie-in with Hamilton. And with those intros, I'm going to pop myself out. I'm going to let Megan take over the conversation, and I'm going to keep an eye in comments for questions as they come in. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Amber. All right, great. Thank you both so much for joining us all tonight. I was hoping we could start off with a quick overview of the books to catch everyone up who is following along. So, Laura, let's start with you. Can you give a quick overview of Hamilton and Peggy, please?
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about why I chose Peggy, or do you want me to talk about that now?
Oh, no, just give us a quick overview of the book, and we'll
Hamilton and Peggy. It's basically a story of Peggy Skyler, who was the youngest Skyler sister. She only has 36 solo words in the musical, to my count. And it turns out that she actually was this fascinating, incredibly intelligent, well-read, well-educated woman. And so it is about her role in the trio and also her friendship with Hamilton. It seems to have been a truly very sweet kind of older brother teasing younger sister relationship. So it stretches from 1777 through Yorktown.
Terrific. And Susan, can you give us a brief overview of...
Mine will be even briefer. It's the Hamilton story from Eliza's point of view. And I'm going to hold this up right. There we go. From the Eliza's point of view. And hers differs a little bit from Hamilton, the musical.
Great. We'll definitely be getting into that later.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry for all you diehard Angelica fans out there. We don't have a Angelica author with us, but all three of us have a lot of thoughts about Angelica. So we will certainly be talking about her tonight, as well as the other two.
She won't be left out.
No, she never is.
So I'd love to, Amber did a great job sort of giving an overview of your bios, but I'd love to start off with a question I like to ask people, which is, how did you start doing what it is that you do? So how did you get into being a writer, and what led you to writing historical fiction novels in particular? Susan, can we start with you?
You want to start? Okay. I have always enjoyed writing, and more importantly, I have always been a ferocious reader, and I think you can't be a writer unless you read all the time. And I'd always sort of toyed with writing. I thought I wouldn't want to do it. And when I was on maternity leave, when my daughter was born, I decided to write my first book, and I wrote it just sort of out of the blue. I was obviously hormonally crazed, because a sensible person would not do that. But I knew that I had maternity leave. So I sat my daughter in cranked up the baby swing, because that's what we had back then, and wrote my first book. And it had I made so many mistakes as far as a first writer, but I didn't know. And I just went ahead and did it. And then I sent it off. And I didn't to an editor whose name I liked on the list. And I didn't hear anything, and I didn't hear anything. And I was convinced that they were, all passing it around the publisher's office, laughing about how awful it was. But, I at that time had gone back to work. It took the better part of a year that I finally got a phone call, and it was from a senior editor, not the person who I'd sent it off to. And she had told me that that the woman I'd written to was no longer with the company. I never found out what happened to her, but this editor had found the manuscript stuffed in a desk when they were having the new person come in. And she felt so badly that it had been there for the better part of a year that she read it herself.
Oh my gosh.
And they bought it.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
That's a great story.
I know. So, and the rest, as I say, is history. I had to, I guess, wrote the first 8 books before, I was still working full time before I could, was doing well enough that I could quit and write full time. And it's a great job.
Great job.
Laura, what about you?
I often joke that I'm an accidental novelist because I was a journalist for 20 years before I took the sidestep into writing fiction. And what I did was I took a story that had been about my dad's experiences as a World War II bomber pilot and his homecoming. He had one of those extraordinary homecomings where everybody basically thought he was dead, and he showed up in the driveway 5 days before Christmas, 1944. So, World War II is full of those kinds of amazing, heart-wrenching, phenomenal stories. And I received so many letters and so many queries and from people that I decided that I was going to fictionalize it. So because to greatly expand that character's serving as an everyman of all these boys who fell out of burning planes and survived because of the French resistance or French civilians. I exist. More importantly, my babies exist because of some French teenagers who saved my dad's life. And that book, Under War-Torn Sky, I was incredibly lucky with. I plan to go right back to the Washingtonian and continue working there. I had done several nonfiction books about things like domestic violence cases as a journalist, but I loved doing the historical writing. I've always been a big history lover. And because that book did so well, I just continued and then stepped into my beloved editor at the Washingtonian magazine was once interviewed about me and my kind of making the shift. And he said, I don't know why she left a good paying job to do what she's doing. But I love what I do. I really, really do.
Great. Well, thank you for those thoughts. So for those of you who are looking forward to seeing the Hamilton musical on Disney Plus on July 3rd, I think it drops at something like 2 a.m. Central Standard Time.
Oh my gosh.
If there are any of you that somehow haven't listened to the soundtrack or know what's going on, there are 3 main female characters in the, 4 main female characters in the story, and 3 of them are Angelica, Eliza, and Peggy Skyler, the Skyler sisters. Eliza, of course, ends up becoming Eliza Hamilton. She marries Alexander Hamilton. But the other 2 sisters have had some really fascinating, had really fascinating lives, and both in the musical and in real life. And so I'd love to jump in next to to the 2 of you talking a little bit about why write a book about these characters, or what about these real life historical women drew you in. So Laura, why don't you start telling us about why Peggy?
Okay, why not Peggy though? I had been lucky enough to see the musical and left it floating on air like everyone else does. And my editor at HarperCollins, Catherine Teagan, who is brilliant and incredibly good to me, said, well, you love this so much, why don't you do something about Hamilton? And I thought, great, but I certainly wasn't going to touch Eliza because there was already this incredible book by this woman, Susan Holloway Scott. So I wasn't going to mess with Eliza. Yeah. And Hamilton was already, Hamilton is sacrosanct. I wasn't going to touch him. There was Peggy, this, who bounces into the first half of the musical with that exuberant and Peggy. And I counted, I can only count 36 solo words that she has. So I thought, well, she in many ways would present this really wonderful Rosencrantz and Guildenstern kind of take, this backstory narrator to look at, be a completely new take on what was happening in the musical. But of course I needed to find out if she really warranted an entire book. So I had to do some really quick hit research. There is this one legend that's known about Peggy that in and of itself is going to make you want to write about her. She dashes into the fray of an attempted kidnapping of her father, General Skyler, by 20 loyalists and their allied Iroquois. It's a home invasion. They're trying to kidnap him. All the family goes running upstairs, a very pregnant Angelica and a pregnant Eliza, all these other little children, Catherine and everybody. They got upstairs and there's this kind of like, where's the baby? Because the littlest baby, Skyler, Katie, is left downstairs. Peggy has the guts to go running back downstairs, dashing through all those men in this, fairly heated fight, to scoop the baby up and to go running back upstairs with the baby, and she also happens to be her goddaughter. So I thought, well, that sounds pretty bodacious. Let's read a little bit more. Now, the thing about Peggy is that there's very little about her specifically. And I had to do a lot of research around her. So what I found quickly, and I had to do this very fast, I had to write it so that I could, ride the Hamilton wave. But people who knew her called her I've got on my list here, wicked wit. She was lively, generous, spirited, the favorite of dinner tables and balls. Ben Franklin called her Wild Peggy. She was fluent in French. She taught herself German by reading her father's engineering manuals. A French aristocrat said she was endowed with a superior mind and a rare accuracy of judgment in men and things. And one of Hamilton's best friends, who I do not like, James McHenry, criticized Peggy as being a Swift's Vanessa. Now, for all you English majors out there, that's Jonathan Swift. It's a fairly obscure poem of his, but calling somebody a Swift's Vanessa was basically 18th century code for a whip-smart woman who didn't know her place, was too interested in talking politics with men to be entirely likable. And McHenry actually writes this to Hamilton and says, "Tell Peggy so. I'm sure her good sense will soon place her in her proper station." Ha! I don't think it did at all. I think she managed to have this kind of proto-feminist attitude, very much like Angelica. Bless the interpreters at the Skyler Mansion, who I asked about 1,000 million questions of. The expert on Angelica felt very much, and people have said this, that Angelica and Peggy were very alike in spirit and in intellect. A few weeks after meeting Peggy, Hamilton writes to Eliza in a love letter to her that Captain Beebe is making toasts to Peggy at George Washington's table. And he says, "I don't consent to Captain Beebe being Peggy's favorite. He's not clever enough for her. He sings well, and that is all." Now, the last thing that I will tell you that made me really want to write about her was that within a few days of meeting Eliza and becoming so besotted with her, Hamilton actually writes to Peggy, in essence asking her to come to Morristown to be his wingman. He says that he has formed a more than common partiality for Peggy's person and mind because of a miniature portrait that Eliza carries with her and has shown Hamilton. So he begs Peggy as a nymph of equal sway to come distract the other aides de camp so that he can monopolize Eliza to himself. He writes, he bemoans having turned into, quote, "the various inamorato you perhaps ever saw because of Eliza's charms," and he complains about it a lot, but that's another story. It's kind of, he said, "she made me fall in love with her almost." Anyway, he concludes, By dividing her empire, it will be weakened, and Eliza will be much less dangerous when she has a rival equal in charms to dispute the prize with her. I solicit your aid. Now, it seems that Peggy, having received that letter, rides off into the worst winter ever recorded in American history. There have been 28 nor'easters that started November 1st, don't end until April 1st, when she rides off 3 days through territory that's occupied by loyalist scouts who would love to capture a Skyler daughter. There are snowdrifts 6 feet high. The harbor in New York has been measured, the ice in it has been measured to be 18 feet deep in some spots, and they are pulling cannon over it. So it would have been really easy for her to have been captured, to have frozen to death, to have died on the way. But she goes. And that's a pretty bodacious, brave, and independent young woman. And she's a swift Vanessa. So why wouldn't you want to write about her? She also, I'll just end really quickly because we want to hear what Susan has to say. I could see from all those things. I write for older young adults, meaning those, high schoolers, precocious high schoolers, college age, to women in their 20s, to us, Susan and my age. But the fact that I also try to include these, I also keep in mind sensibilities for those juniors and seniors in high school. Peggy is this smart girl who gets damned for her intellect and is told to be quiet. And I think she really speaks to young women, really smart, who perhaps intimidate the boys in their class so that she doesn't get invited to prom. I think she also speaks really well to younger sisters who are constantly overshadowed by and left behind by older siblings when they go off to college or to get married. I mean, one sister, Angelica, is known as the Thief of Hearts. Liza is known as the little saint of the revolution. That's a lot to live up to. So I think she covers that. And I also, we can talk more about this later, but she has a romance that ends in ghosting. And I think if you guys know the term ghosting, which I learned from my kids, it gives me a chance to show that a young woman can be perfectly fine if a boy is foolish enough to walk away from her. So with all that kind of extraordinary character and personality, I definitely wanted to write about Peggy.
Awesome. Thank you. Susan, what drew you to Eliza and her story?
Well, I grew up in the New York area and northern New Jersey, and Alexander Hamilton is that area's famous founding father. There are more statues of Hamilton in Manhattan and in the boroughs than there is anybody else, which really surprised me. So everybody sort of knew about Alexander Hamilton. And at some point I came across Eliza and thought, there's so little, for all that everyone knows about her, she made a point of there not being anything about her by destroying all her letters in response to him or to Hamilton. So she's sort of an enigma in her marriage. And I think a lot of Hamilton biographers just kind of brush her off. She's she was a rich girl. He married her for her father's money, that kind of thing. And I knew that there had to be more to it than that, because it does come across. She's fiercely loyal to him. After his death, she could have remarried. She was a young widow. She never did. And she continued to wear mourning for him for another 50 years. So she loved him very dearly. And I wanted to know more about her and find out more about her, which is why you write books. But at the time, this was probably 2011, I guess. And somewhere out there is a blog post by me saying, I really want to write about Eliza Hamilton. But at that point, the American Revolution was no one in publishing wanted to publish any books about the American Revolution. They thought it was boring. It was, dull. It was the kind of stuff you learned in high school. No one wants to read that. And so I couldn't sell a book about Eliza. But fast forward, and thanks to Lin-Manuel Miranda, an editor called up my agent and said, does she still have that idea? Would she still be willing to write that book? And I wrote it really, really fast, partly because I'd been thinking about it. But as Laura said, we're all trying to jump on, get on that bandwagon, which fortunately just keeps rolling along. I think people are fascinated by the Hamiltons, and that doesn't seem to be stopping, especially with all the enthusiasm about the film coming out this week. And I really did enjoy getting to know Eliza and to try and sort of come, make her into a real person as opposed to the way that she's shown so often in Hamilton biographies.
Great, thank you. I'm curious because, it's mentioned in the musical, but it's also a historical fact that Eliza got rid of all of her letters. She burned, or someone got rid.
We don't know if she burned them, or my feeling is that it's probably one of her sons, because it became a family project to write. Excuse the cats. A family project to write the definitive biography of Hamilton, and they were very conscious of who tells your story, and they shaped it very carefully. And I think whether one of her sons said, "Mom, let's get rid of these letters. They may be too revealing. You don't really want that on you," or if she decided that. We'll never know. But I still live in hope that somewhere they're in a chest somewhere, and some descendant is going to, be cleaning out the garage and find them.
Great, thank you. Both of you have mentioned that, and you touched on this a little bit, that you weren't able to use their words, because we don't have really anything in Eliza's. We don't have much written by Eliza, if anything, written by Eliza, and we have nothing from Peggy. So how did you go about creating, sorry, this is sort of an impromptu question, but I'm just curious, how did you go about creating their voices and bringing them to life, by mostly researching what other people said about her? What was that like? Well,
there's also lots of letters. For Eliza, it's just her correspondence with Alexander that's missing. All the other ones are still there. So that there are some foolish male historians who say that she destroyed her letters because she was basically illiterate and couldn't do it, which is foolish. She was, as Laura said about Peggy, those sisters were very well educated. So you get a sense of her voice in her letters to her children, to her sisters, to her parents. And you can sort of, that's part of what novelists do, is that we find as much of the primary source things and then turn it into a voice and a character.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you.
I didn't have anything of Peggy's, so it really did, and we can talk about it more, but it was Hamilton's letters that helped me really know what a person, because he kept dropping all this gossip about her, so I could glean a lot from that.
Great.
He writes great letters too.
Oh, amazing.
What were some? I'm curious. I know both of you did a lot of quick but very thorough research. What were some things you learned about the Skylers, or about the people you were writing about, or the time? Things that surprised you that you weren't expecting to discover, or things you learned in the process of writing these books.
Do you want to
start? Okay, I'll talk.
Mary, you went first last time, so you can go first.
All right. Okay. Well, I'll go back to these letters. Because really, just to answer your thing about how I found Peggy's voice, there are not a lot of letters, but Hamilton's letters are so lush and descriptive and full of his personality. And when he teases somebody, he knows the person. You can just tell. So there was this kind of an immediate big brotherly teasing of Peggy. He started calling her my Peggy and my little sister and sprightly Peggy. And I'll just tell you actually about one of the surprises in one of the characters too, if I can. I'll try to do it really fast. But like I said, he tended to drop gossip about Peggy in his love letters to Eliza. And with those tidbits, that corroborated for me where Peggy could be. And that she was at the right place at the right time to really witness some of the more cataclysmic and important events of the Revolution. I used that book to really bear witness to upstate New York and what was going on before the Battle of Saratoga, the Loyalists, the Oneida that were the allies. And I can thank Hamilton for that, but I'll just give you an example of one particular letter, if I can. On September 3rd in 1780, he's engaged to Eliza at this point. And as Susan says, this is a good example. If you find a little nugget and you go, ooh, I can use that to expand. I've got it here from part of it. On September 3rd, Hamilton writes Eliza to thank her for this pretty little song, as he calls it, that she sent him, which reassures him about her affections. And then he goes on to talk about this pretty little Dutch girl of 15 that is turning the heads of all the other aides de camp. But Eliza's not to worry. because Hamilton's not tempted by her because, quote, I am persuaded she has no soul, and I am squeamish enough to require a soul in a woman. I run no great risk of becoming one of her captives. But then he ends the letter with this thing about Peggy, which is, when your sister returns home, I shall try to get her in my interest and make her tell me of all your flirtations. Have you heard anything more of what I hinted to you about Fleury? When she returns, give my love to her and tell her I expected she would have outstripped you in the hymeneal line. Adieu, my love, A. Hamilton. Okay, there's so much to unpack in all of that double entendre, hymeneal line, and all that stuff. But my immediate reaction was, well, who the heck is Fleury? And as it took me a lot to track down who Fleury actually was. He seems to have been this kind of little-known Lafayette type. He was a professional soldier who came and presented himself to the Continental Congress to give his service to the army and to the cause. But he's hardly known except for the fact that he's one of only 8 individuals who was awarded a Congressional Medal of Honor during the Revolution, and that was for his leadership at Stony Point, where he actually led the suicidal bayonet-only charge up this cliff over into the fort to dislodge the British. He also seems to have shared his reward money with them. And he seems to have been a very enthusiastic engineer. He writes this one, I could track him down with this one letter to Washington where he's basically like, George, I've got this great idea, which is I can put together these self-propelled exploding boats and take down the British fleet near Philadelphia. And Washington responds that he should get a contingent of desperate fellows to try this out. But I corroborated this really wonderful kind of geeky scientist personality by tracking down the Newport residents who housed him when he came back with Rochambeau's troops, who called him Fleury, was sociable, jocose, very agreeable in conversation, of a free, liberal turn of mind. So with all that as background, all those little tidbits and breadcrumbs that I'm following, Fleury is definitely Peggy's kind of girl. He's brave, he's ingenious, he is open-minded, he's generous, somebody who might really enjoy a Swift's Vanessa. So, I mean, it made sense and was plausible to me that there could be a romance. I was able to corroborate it by Hamilton gossiping about a kiss by a carriage and a letter that Fleury sends to him saying, we may be related because you probably know I have these feelings for Miss Peggy, but if that doesn't work out, I'm going to convince Mr. Duane to let me marry one of his daughters too. And then I don't have any more information about what happens to them, which is kind of hence the ghosting theme. But it allowed this kind of wonderful the Madame who talks about her being fluent in French talks about Peggy having gone and to the French encampments with her father. So it allowed me to kind of get into this wonderful world of the French. The other big surprise was Moses Harris, my most favorite character that I think you're going to ask us about, maybe our favorite character. But the other huge surprise was the fact that Philip Skyler ran this extraordinarily important spy ring out of the house in the Skyler mansion. And I managed to find a trip up on this young yeoman soldier named Moses Harris, who may have kind of saved the Patriot cause because he was walking along a path, stumbled up on 3 loyalist couriers. And he's suspicious. He's a savvy guy. He's got the gift of gab, and he had some peach brandy in his back pocket, and he chatted up these guys and got some important information out of them. But I can talk about that again in a minute.
Okay. Great. So, but you would say that Fleury is one of those sort of like lost heroes. Right?
Yes, he truly is. And it was hard to track him down. Except once I found out about Stony Point. And the way I found out about the medal was through the U.S. Army website. You know, you have to follow it going odd tangents sometimes. But he was kind of this unknown hero. And in truth, we've got a lot of those. And a lot of the French officers, and these unsung heroes like Moses Harris, who I hope to talk about more in a minute. Yeah, I mean, I think he was a critically important person at a specific, at a really critical battle. Stony Point kind of helped hold the Hudson. So
great. Susan, what were some surprises as you were working on your book?
I think that, well, one of the things is, I said, that there's known, as far as the relationship between Alexander and Liza, we only have one side of the story, but you can tell what her response is from his letters. Unlike Laura, I don't have any to read from, but the one of the things that I really enjoyed about reading his letters is that so many of them are in collections. The originals are in collections that I was able to visit. And so you can see more than just the transcription and understand sort of what's going through them. So that when he's courting her in the early days, his letters are very flowery and they're full of all this wonderful praise for you. And it's very poetical in the language of 18th century suitors. And it's almost to the point of having little smiley faces and hearts and flowers. They're very lush, but they're beautiful love letters. And I'm sure Eliza really enjoyed getting them. And you can tell that too, because they're folded, the way they're folded, you can tell that she reread them, opened them up, read them, reread probably her entire life. They've got deep creases in them. But you have that kind of, that part of their, said their courtship letters, then the letters that he writes while he's away at war. And he doesn't know if he's ever going to see her again, especially when he's going to Yorktown. He knows that she's pregnant. He doesn't know if he's going to see her or ever see their unknown, their unborn child. So that the letters that he writes to her then, there's none of the flowery stuff. It's just, he's very busy. He's with the army. They're just these like one sentence, very terse, saying things like, I hope I see you again. I hope that, take care of yourself until we meet again, but they're very, in a way, those to me are much more poignant because he's very conscious of this may be the last time I can get a letter through the lines back to her. And those are often just written on scraps of paper. There's no hearts and flowers. There's no lush adjectives. And you go from those letters to the letters during their marriage, you realize how incredibly dependent not only that he loves her, but that he's very dependent on her. And I think that's something that is overlooked. I don't think he would have become the man that he was without her in the background as the sounding board and also raising this huge household full of children. I know we're going to talk about the musical later on. I think it's one of the things that sort of does a disservice to her by only mentioning Philip when she has a whole lot of other children too. And that she's very much runs his household, takes care of everything so that he doesn't have to worry about it. There are references in some of the letters from their mutual friends sort of implying that without him, things would just be a total house of cards, that she really sort of keeps everything going behind the scenes. And I think that was really, that was wonderful to discover that she is really doing all this stuff. And then also, of course, then you have the final letter, the Best of Wives letter, which is just probably one of the most heartbreaking letters ever. To see that one. And unfortunately, we're coming up on that date too, which is not a date that Hamilton fans want to celebrate, but the night of the duel.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the musical. I think we probably should, start to segue into that a little bit. You mentioned the absence of the additional Hamilton children, and but also the fact that that there are some direct quotes, which I don't know if the people that are listening to know, but there's a lot of direct quotes in the musical from things that
from letters,
yeah. And if you haven't, if you're a diehard Hamilton fan and you haven't gotten that massive book that's the script with all of the notes in it, I would really recommend it because you can actually see.
You can get it for one more page.
Yes. Conversation. But it's got great little notes about, this is a real thing this person did. So I'm curious, going back to our women here, what are some of the things you think that the creators of Hamilton did a good job with in terms of capturing the time or these women or the historical details? I'm curious to hear what you thought was really, from someone who has spent a lot, from people who spent a lot of time with these women. What did they get right? What resonated with you?
Your turn, Susan.
Okay, I think that the main thing is that the closeness of the sisters.
Yeah.
Because they were each other's best friends, and they relied on each other and depended on each other. Their children were friends. So I think that they got that right. I think that as far as Eliza, one of the things that they got wrong is that she's the needy one almost in that in the play. We don't see her. We see her very much in the beginning as Hamilton's, the girl that Hamilton wants to marry. Then they get married, and then she disappears. She's off stage, but she's sort of, there's that one scene or one song that drives me crazy where she is asking. It says that she writes to General Washington to ask him to come home, to send Hamilton home, which is not. No, she's a daughter of a general. She would know better than, you don't write the commander in chief and say, can my husband have paternity leave in the middle of the war and come home and take care of me? Which she did not do. In reality, Hamilton has sort of a falling out with Washington on his own and leaves. So there's no going back home. But she would, as I said, she's a stronger woman than she comes across in that. And I kind of wish she was more like that. At the end, where she gets to sing her final song, she's great. She is very much a powerhouse, and I will always have a weakness for Byrne because it's a beautiful song.
Cry every time.
I know, you can't help it.
Well, from my perspective, and what's right and what's wrong, I echo what Susan said about the kind of extraordinary closeness among the three of them. They're almost like triplets because they were all born within
close together.
months. Yeah, I think Eliza's 18 months past after Angelica, and Peggy's only 13 months past after Eliza. And if you go to that original letter that I mentioned to you that Hamilton sends to Peggy saying, "Come be my wingman. I've fallen in love. I've fallen in love. Your sisters made me fall in love. Please come help me." He mentions that. The reason he already has this good opinion of her person and mind, is because of this miniature portrait that Eliza has painted of Peggy and carries with her. So she painted it, she carries it with her, and then she shows it. And Peggy was quite beautiful. She shows the portrait of this beautiful younger sister to a would-be suitor that we think she's in love with almost immediately. That's a real tightness and bond, and I think they managed to. I think that one of the things the musical does really well is that celebration of sisterhood and kind of almost a Jane Austen sticking by one another no matter what rogue comes into the circle, right? The thing that I will launch into what's wrong from my perspective is I tend to get really protective of these people that I spend so much time researching, and Peggy really is shunned to the side, and I'm not exactly sure why. Even Ron Chernow does it about her too. Here's the truth. Diehard Angelica fans get upset when I say this, but Angelica was already married when they met Hamilton. She was a mother already at that point.
We talk about this a lot.
Yeah, she had eloped with John Carter in 1777. When Hamilton wants a sister to help him in his courtship of Eliza, it's to Peggy he turns. And he wants to write he says that he's going to write a play for Peggy because he finds her so entertaining and she's, the favorite at dinner tables. He writes later after they're married and they have their children. And, Hamilton valued above all else, I think, intellect. And he's going to send his children to Aunt Peggy to be educated one summer. I mean, he says it in a letter that they're going to be sending her so she can teach them things. She was incredibly bright, and he was perhaps even in the room with her as she died when she was 43 years old, probably died of stomach cancer. She died early, and I think that's another reason why we don't know as much about her. What I think he got right about Angelica, I will just say, the musical, Lin-Manuel Miranda did this extraordinary thing. He took this entire life and made it this kind of legend. He's like the Homer of the American Revolution. No, he really is. I mean, everything he did was extraordinary, and he couldn't cover everybody and everything. So what he got was the essence of Angelica, I think. And Susan, you should weigh in on this as well. But I think, he telescoped their relationship and the kind of intellectual romance that they had. He does it again with like the song Hurricane, which is kind of this brilliant. He refers to having survived a hurricane in 1772. It's the fact that he wrote his way out. He wrote his own deliverance. Is how he got out of the island. People raised money because of this young teenager who wrote this amazing essay and got him to the mainland. He also does himself in with his writing and with this impending political storm that he's going to cause for himself with his own hubris. So, I mean, it is a kind of talk about, the classic kind of tragedy, right, in the fallen hero. So, but, I hope people will enjoy reading about Peggy. She deserves her own novel. She really does. And she was very engaged in her sisters' lives. Susan?
Well, we're talking, look, I know we have some Angelica fans here.
Yes,
too.
of course.
I think that's one of the biggest, and as a writer, as a fiction writer, I know sometimes you look for your story arc, you look for your conflict in real life. But there was no romantic relationship. There was no affair between Angelica and Hamilton. I think it's just Angelica was sort of flirtatious by nature, and so was Hamilton. They go back and forth. But even when you read the letters that are supposed to be these great love letters, it's very clear that he's the one that's more kind of like, ooh, I'm going to write to her and I'm going to say all these things. And she kind of goes, yes, say hi to your wife. It's not the great romantic thing. And she's married to a man that in a lot of ways is higher up on the social scale and has a lot more that apparently what she was looking for than Hamilton ever could. As Laura said, she eloped with a man who presented himself as John Carter. And actually his name. Yeah, I know, with a good anonymous name like John Smith. But he shows up on the scene and he has all these sort of aristocratic airs, and he has a hint of mystery about him. And he probably told Angelica, well, I'm on the lam. Don't tell anybody, especially don't tell your father. Part of my deep dark secret that I probably shot a member of parliament and had to leave really fast. But
he was defending a woman's honor, right? Is what he may have said too.
Yeah, he probably said a lot of things. But there wouldn't have been anybody else in Albany during the Revolution that was quite like John Barker Church. And in a lot of ways, I think that she thought that she wanted to lead this great glamorous life. And after the war, certainly he makes, this is one of the things that people don't talk about, is that he comes over, he's not idealistic. He comes to America basically to make a lot of money, and he does. And so when he finally takes her over to England and to France, they're very, very rich. And I think that was probably what she imagined that she wanted. That she wanted to have a great position in British society. She wanted to be introduced presented at the French court, all of which she was. But at some point, all that begins to sort of sour, and she wants to be back home. And eventually she does talk her husband into coming back to New York, where she stays until she dies. But I don't think that, given everything that he was, Hamilton would have had a hard time competing with that anyway.
She'd already been swept off her. And the thing about when she elopes too, I mean, she must have been what a scintillating, vivacious, captivating, overwhelming in personality, right? She eloped.
Oldest daughter always is.
Yes, yeah, but I mean, I think she was just kind of this bright light that everybody was just captivated by. She elopes in the middle of, Carter, he was known as John Carter at that point. He comes to check Skyler's books because Congress. John Adams, what is it about John Adams? He goes after everybody. He didn't like Philip Schuyler either. But anyway, they're questioning his leadership of the Northern Army at that point. Carter comes to like look at his books. So to begin with, I don't think Papa Skyler would have really loved this guy to begin with. And then it is literally in the middle of the British invasion from Canada. Ticonderoga has just fallen. Their 3,000 Continental soldiers disappeared into the night. That's when Angelica runs off with John Carter. So I think she was a little headstrong in a wonderful way. But I think the character that Manuel has created captures all the best of her, don't you, Susan? I mean, I think in terms of her kind
also
of
her loyalty and her strength.
Yes,
is very much there.
Yeah, the jewels of her personality, her intellect, her interest in talking politics, in reading, the treatises of the time. I mean, I think he really distilled her down to the most kind of inspiring and.
Well, she becomes she's like they make her. She's the smart sister. It's like the sisters all are kind of like the smart sister. Peggy becomes the kind of goofy, flirty sister, and Eliza is the good, stolid sister. When in reality, I think all three of those women were smart and savvy, and they could have all been like the Angelica character.
Yeah, the other thing that I'd tell you too about Peggy, there are several references of her riding into the wilderness with her mother. We haven't had a chance to talk about Catherine Skyler, who is another formidable and rather amazing woman. For one thing, she gave birth 15 times. Is that correct? 15 pregnancies.
And only half of them survive.
Right, with triplets and twins. Yeah. But once when she was pregnant, and her husband was ill with the violent fluxes or gout, not certain, but on the way to the campaign to Canada, I think Eliza goes as well, but Peggy and Catherine go into the wilderness to take care of him. Peggy also goes with Catherine, it seems, when Catherine rides toward the invading army of Burgoyne to try to get supplies from the Skyler's farm in Saratoga. So, I mean, these were strong-willed, all of them. But all three of those sisters, they were the amiable, dark-eyed sisters, but they were also, incredibly well-read and informed. And obviously, Skyler or somebody encouraged that in them.
Yeah, they were very capable. And the way that I sort of think of a lot of the women from the American women of that generation is that we say, oh, yes, they can dance a minuet, they can speak French, but they also knew how to run a household. They knew how to take care of the people in their house. They had some medical knowledge. They were, and they running a large household, an elite household, meant that you were basically running a small corporation. You had to feed all those people. You had to figure out who's coming, who's going to be a guest. You had to make do in the winter when there isn't as much food. You have to balance all your books. So they know a lot of things.
Can I just give one example of that really fast? Yeah. So after the Battle of Saratoga, right, their home has been burned by Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne.
Yeah, it's a piece of work.
Yeah, quite a piece of work. He was a playwright, but he also burned everything that he could find as he came down from Canada. Anyway, after the surrender, Philip Schuyler basically says, you can come stay with me for a while we arrange for, your POW, how you're going to be transported.
You burned my other house, but come stay here.
Right, come stay here. And then he leaves. He goes back to rebuild the house in Saratoga. Yeah. And Catherine and Peggy was there, have to entertain all of Burgoyne's people, the Hessian, the leader who's there with his wife and her three daughters, Baroness Van Rysendale. And they have to contend with, they have to find, banquet level food for these enemies that have burned down their house and entertain them. I mean, the women, they don't get enough credit for the diplomatic things that they had to, the dance that they had to do, the strategic planning they had to do. And often, at a moment's notice, one of the things that I found surprising too, Megan, that we don't often think about refugees during the American Revolution. One of the things I have Peggy encounter, because it would have been happening entirely plausible she would have, because it's the same road. There was just this mass of humanity fleeing in front of Burgoyne, driving their cattle into the city of Albany. And there's this just heartbreaking poem written by a distant cousin, Anna Skyler Bleecker, about her baby dying on the flight in front of Burgoyne. Women did that. Women had to pick up their children and carry them and go and find a way to feed them and take care of them in this onslaught. And the other thing about upstate New York that we don't really talk about that much, that again, because Peggy was there, I could get into a little bit more talking about women's agency, is that it was such a civil war there. There were so many loyalists. And it was really neighbors against neighbors. So if you're on that road fleeing to Albany, there's no guarantee that somebody from a house on that way isn't going to be a loyalist who might like to take a pot shot at you. Extraordinary women.
Yes.
Well, and I think that experience too carries on later on, long after the war, but during the French Revolution, when there are so many refugees from France coming to America. Both Eliza and Angelica are very involved in finding relief, finding homes, places where these people can stay, and looking after them. And it's one of the first things that, Eliza being, obviously everyone knows about Eliza and the orphanage, but all along, she's very involved with charitable organizations and looking after the people who are lost, that society is kind of like pushing by the wayside. We don't think about that as much now, but there are so many. Any child could be orphaned at any time without a safety net in the 18th century. So, since we're getting towards 8 o'clock, do we have?
Yes, I was just about to say we should probably start to segue to people's questions. I could listen to the two of you talk about this all night.
Well, we could.
So there's been a couple of interesting questions that have come in. One of the first ones was. Was it common for relatives and spouses to of people
to burn the correspondence? I'm seeing the letter here, or the comment.
Yeah.
Yes, upper class women did burn their correspondence because it's the only way, especially if you're in the public life, like Martha Washington and Eliza Hamilton. The only way that you could be guaranteed that the letters would not fall into the wrong hands and be published. I still want to know who released, somebody close to Eliza, and maybe Eliza herself. That first, the letter, that the Best of Wives letter, appears in New York newspapers very shortly after his death. So somebody shared that, and just like now, everyone wants juicy gossip. They want to read letters. So I'm sure that's why most women did, in fact, burn them if there was anything personal.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
There's another question about how do you think Eliza and Peggy would like how you told their story? I'll just add on to that of, what do you think? What do you think they would think about the two of them being immortalized this way?
Okay, Laura.
Me. Oh God, I would love to be able to sit down with Peggy and ask her what she thought about it, and then I would steel myself because she'd probably speak to me in French, which I don't speak, and this wicked wit. I'm sure she would find something to skewer, but I think. I have faith. You guys can probably tell that I've become very protective of this woman because she's been so ignored and I really don't like the fact that Chernow calls her supercilious. I don't know where he gets that from. Excuse me. Anyway.
No, but he gets past the woman really fast.
Yeah. Anyway.
He's not into the women.
Yeah, but I think what I think
the historical women there.
I think that I hope that she would be proud of being a role model for young women in terms of keeping your head, being loyal to your sisters, finding your own path, even if you're overshadowed. And I think I get the sense that I bet Peggy had to do some negotiating between the two of them sometimes. I'm sure Eliza did as well. But I think it took a lot for Peggy to have her own sense of self at the same time that she would be so supportive of these sisters. You know, I do speak in schools a lot, and I have to say that and here's something else to thank you, Lin-Manuel Miranda, the sense of agency and having being part of the narrative that these young high school women feel now, because I'll be sitting in front of 600 kids in an auditorium, and the Skyler Sister song will start in the corner, and then it just kind of goes in this wave through everybody. And then at the end, they all do that work thing. You know, it is an amazing dovetailing with this, you know, women's movement, particularly the last couple of years. And, you know, I would hope that Peggy would like that.
But Laura's right in that we get very protective. I mean, these people, they become very real to us. And we get very defensive and people say things that we don't like. So I hope that Eliza would approve. I think she would probably think it was too personal, because I think she always wanted to sort of be, as far as in her marriage, she wanted to sort of be in the background. Later on in the way that it's told, she really wants her husband's story to be in the front and not to pay attention to her. My sense is that Eliza has, just sort of to digress, has two distinct lives. She has the first life, the first part of her life where she's married to Alexander, and she's very content with having, you know, being a partner with him, but he's up front. But then when he dies, she gets a whole second act of her own. And I didn't get to write this, so my book would have been like 1,200 pages long and no one would have published it. But she has another, you know, whole 50 years where she is very much her own woman. And I think that probably that Eliza would have been really fascinating I would enjoy talking to as well, but who knows?
I went to the Skyler Mansion with my family, and I'll just share the quick anecdote. I'm sure you both know about this, but one of the tour guides was saying that Eliza, when she was older, there's some account of some guy came to visit the house and was like, "Oh, Eliza Hamilton," like, and at that point she was like in her 70s, you know, and she was like, "Oh, we should go for a walk," and he was like, "Okay, great," and she led them on this like 7-mile hike, like in her dress, like up a waterfall.
She's very much, yeah,
come on,
and she used to take she would take basically the commuter rail home from working at the orphanage, and instead of taking a carriage from the station to her house, she would just hike it, you know, across fields and things like that. She's very, very intrepid and was a great walker. Apparently she outwalked many men.
That's awesome. There was a great question that just popped up about the younger Skyler siblings and how we never talk about them. For those who
they're not in the play.
Yeah,
nobody knows about them.
Yeah, there's that line in the musical, right? That my father has no sons, so I'm the one who has to.
Which isn't true.
Which isn't true. Yeah, and she certainly didn't. Well, she didn't do it for social status. But anyway,
but there was a whole crew of kids after.
There were 3 sons, and Cornelia and Katie. Right? Have I got everybody? Rensselaer, Jeremiah, John, Cornelia, and Katie. I got it all.
Yeah, you did really well there.
Yeah, and you know there was a gap of it was like 5 or 6 years, I think, between the trio, the 3 girls.
She miscarries and loses babies, and
right,
yeah,
right. I mean, she loses some babies in between. But she honestly, I calculated it, and I'm sorry, I can't pull it off the top of my head right now, but she was pregnant. You know, the last child was born when she was 47 years old, and the baby, Katie, was born on Angelica's 25th birthday. So, I mean, that's the expanse of her birthing. And I think, I know Peggy in particular is often relegated as the babysitter and as the kind of caretaker for this younger brood, because Angelica's run off and gotten married and is in Boston and wherever else with John Carter early on. Eliza gets married and she goes, and it seems Susan would know more than I, but obviously, but it seems like she kind of left the house a lot to go visit Angelica or other people while some of these other babies were being born. And there were
but the generation spread like that. It's like the children of Angelica and Eliza are the same age as their own as their
siblings.
cousins. Everybody is sort of this one generation, even though they're aunts and uncles.
Peggy had, there's some implications that Peggy may have had the beginnings of gout, like her father. And so I think she wasn't as mobile. But she also, after Angelica, I couldn't include it in the book, but there's right after Angelica has her baby, right around the Yorktown time, she wants to go south, and they're crossing battle lines, and Peggy goes with them, clearly as the helpmate for the new baby, plus the toddler little girl and Philip, the other. Part of the reason why I think Angelica, I feel like I stepped on the beautiful Angelica. She was evidently quite a good mother. And part of the reason of the mayhem of that attempted kidnapping of Skyler was because Philip had gone to muskets that had been loaded and by the door in anticipating a home invasion like this. And Angelica made them put them in the bait cellar. So that's partially why that whole skirmish was as bad as it was.
Great. Okay, so we need to start to wrap up, but there's another question I just want to throw up here because I think the two of you will enjoy it.
Maybe we could do it together.
Is there an Angelica book?
Elaborate on an Angelica book, but I am curious, I'm sure our listeners are curious too about, what's next for both of you.
Hi, Tanya.
Tanya.
I really would love to write an Angelica book, but I don't know. We know that somebody who, one of the women who's worked at the Skyler Mansion, Danielle Funicello, is working on a nonfiction biography of
And
Angelica.
I can hardly wait for it because she is the Angelica expert. She really is.
Yeah. But you never know. We never know. I saw someone asked if I was still writing about Martha, and yes, I am writing about Martha right now.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. Martha Washington. And you didn't ask us that. All right. I'm sorry. I was just jumping ahead. But writing about, since Martha was very close to, or Eliza was close to Martha, they were sort of similar temperament. I sort of became interested in Martha at that point. But now it's been really fun finding the real Martha, who is not just that big poofy haired, sweet old lady who becomes the mother of the country.
Right.
She is not like that. That book should come out next fall. I'm still writing it, but probably next fall. I saw somebody had asked about that. But anyway.
A great novel about Angelica, if somebody did a novel on her, would be how she helped people escape the French Revolution.
Be that. Well, and then you have all of her life in Europe, and
that would be fascinating.
I don't remember the details about this, but I remember hearing some story about how Angelica and her husband at one point tried to bust, I think it was Lafayette, out of prison.
Yeah, it didn't work.
He ends up in Belgium, I think, in prison.
They try, and it doesn't. I don't remember the details. One of the things that I think is so interesting about the two sisters too is that they have children that are more or less the same age, but Angelica's children had been gone to schools in France and in London, and are going to be so much more sophisticated, and they're rich, as opposed to the Hamilton kids, who were very much homebodies, went to school in New York. And I think that they were the glamorous cousins that come. And I think one of the things that they don't talk about is that Angelica has a son named Philip too, who's a little bit older than the Hamiltons' Philip. And he is the second at that duel for his cousin. And it seems like in a lot of ways that was probably one of an incredibly stressful time between the two sisters. You're Philip, you're Philip, and you really want to know, did he bring his father's gun? How much was he arranging all this for the other one? And definitely there's a cooling in the relationship between the two sisters after that. I know it's really sad.
That's interesting.
It's really sad.
I feel like a lot of people pin that on their relationship with Hamilton, but it could actually be
that
with the children, and that would make sense.
Yeah.
Laura, what's next for you? And do you have any interest in returning to the Revolution?
They have a book coming
She
out
has a cover.
in August. I know this. I have a book coming out in August, which is very different. It's a contemporary, whimsical, first-person, 14-year-old girl who finds her redemption in dogs, nature, music, an Afghanistan war veteran, and dog dancing. So, but that's really different. It just came out of me. It's completely different. I just finished a book. I'm kind of schizophrenic. I write these older YA female biographical novels like Peggy or Ginevra da Benci with Leonardo, and then these boy books for younger teens. So I just finished one about Berlin, the Berlin Wall going up, which will be out this time next year, hopefully. I would love to go back to the Revolution. I actually have several things kind of percolating in my brain that I would really love to address. I'm kind of fascinated by the Livingston girls and young Hamilton in the Livingston household with those.
There's really only 100 people in the American.
Exactly. Exactly.
The same people all know everybody else.
Yeah, they do. But anyway, I would love to go after that story.
The Livingstons were cousins, right? Of the Skyler?
Yeah, they were distant cousins, yes, but they were definitely friends. And Kitty Livingston, she's the first recipient of these wondrously ardent, filled with classical reference, bombast, and vulnerability from Hamilton. The thing that's so, do go, you can find these letters, you all, and read them for yourselves on foundersarchive.gov. They are phenomenally moving, funny, and you really see Hamilton everywhere from the budding statesman to the incredible intricacy of his mind to this really vulnerable young guy. There's this literally one letter, I can't remember the exact circumstances, maybe Susan could, but when he says basically, I hate the army, I hate life, I hate myself, you know, and he says,
Yeah.
he's
Drama.
a 15-year-old.
Drama.
So,
Oh man, that's it.
but it's wonderful, you know, especially as a mother, you just kind of go, oh, sweetie, come sit down, have a cookie.
Yeah, I don't. Whenever I read about Washington having to deal with all these aides de camp, I don't know how he did it, because I think they just must have always. Everybody's getting in a huff over something. Everybody's indignant and sure their honor is ruined, and somehow Washington holds them all together.
You know, I always say that too, Susan. I kind of fell in love with George Washington in some ways, just that very thing, because he didn't have a patient nature. By nature, that wasn't his.
No,
he had a pretty hot temper, which he had to learn how to control in the midst of all of these idealistic young boys who were kind of desperate to be in his favor. And the other thing that I really love, the other surprise, is how much of a kind of literary bro frat thing there was among the aides de camp. They wrote each other poems. They ripped each other all the time. There's a lot of love among those young men.
So it's the age of sentiment too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Terrific. Well, we've gone a little bit over, so I think we need to start to time wrap up. Thank you both so much. For
You're still there.
All up and about for us.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you all so much, Laura, Susan, Megan. Thank you for leading the discussion, and thanks to everybody who tuned in online. We got some great questions, and the video will stay exactly where it is right now. The link on Facebook will remain the same. The link on YouTube will remain the same. I will go in and add a couple of links if folks are looking for any of these books. I'll add links in the comments so that they're easy to find. All right. Thank you. Everybody enjoy Hamilton.
Thank you for having us today, everybody who came out, and enjoy Hamilton on Friday.
Yes, it's
at 2 a.m.
Fun. I know. I'll be there. I'll see you guys there. Thank you so much.
Everyone. Thank you.
Thank
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.